Welcome to another episode of Timeless Wealth. Today we have a special guest joining us, Tiffany Zhang from the ETF and Financial Products Group with National Bank.
Very exciting.
We thought we'd have Tiffany on because ETFs, very common in today, right?
Mhm.
And it's had explosive growth. Like I
Yeah.
remember many years ago, you had a few ETF providers, but now there are so many different combinations
Yeah.
and different ways they
And
work.
many more ETF products as well.
Tons of them.
And I think we're seeing a lot of clients get, what they want more and more exposure through ETFs.
Yeah, and everybody's kind of dabbling in it. And how do you know one's better than another? So we thought, well, who better to bring on than Tiffany and her team to talk about the research that we actually provide here and to give us some insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing, Amy, that's interesting here about the ETF team at National Bank is, and I believe you explained this to me, is the objectivity that we have in our research and analysis, as well as other institutions. The ETF team may work under specific arms. Our team here is probably as objective as it can get.
Yeah,
'cause
they're
they work
housed right on the equity research
Yep,
team. So
yeah,
they're not
so-
incented to like sell a certain product.
Right.
They're really agnostic as to say, here's what they are and here's where they fit and where they don't fit,
Yeah,
and
so
to provide really good advice.
Yeah, so having Tiffany speak about herself and her team and what they do and the value they bring would be really pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, so we're lucky to have them. So coming up next. Welcome back. So I'm joined today, Jalal, we have a special guest here.
Very special one.
I know. Tiffany Zhang, Vice President in the ETF and Financial Products team here at National Bank. Welcome, Tiffany.
Welcome, Tiffany.
This is awesome. Thank you so much for having me, guys.
We're excited to have you on just to understand, the ETF landscape. A lot of clients, it's become a tool that a lot of people are more familiar with today than ever before, but boy, has it ever changed. And just a backstory. So Tiffany and I actually knew each other before we ended up at National Bank.
How?
We go way back.
Yes.
She emailed me when we moved. I got this lovely email saying, I'm here. And I went, oh my gosh. So we met through Women in Capital Markets back in the day and through their mentorship program.
Nice.
Yeah, I was Amy's mentee.
Yeah.
That is super cool.
Now look at her. She's a rock star in the ETF world. And I rely on your research to help make financial decisions in our portfolio.
World.
We've come full circle, which is lovely.
Well, that speaks to your mentorship capabilities.
Yeah. I don't know. She's pretty bright. She's super.
No. I learned a lot from you, Amy. And one thing I will always remember is that you told me in order to be good at anything, you got to have passion and sense of purpose.
Oh, 100%.
It's true.
And that really has resonated with me over the years. And it's been such a positive influence on my career and my life. So thank you.
Absolutely. Speaking of passion, just before this, we were talking about how much you love skiing. And
how much you love
skateboarding.
skateboarding.
we can go into the debate another time as to what's better and what's cooler between boarding and skiing. But today we'll keep it around ETFs.
We'll keep it around ETFs. So just as a back story, so the ETF group has been around over 10 years here at National Bank. So we have a long track record of, independent research in ETFs and financial products. You cover over, when I read this, I had to read it a few times, 1,400 products in Canada and over 3,000 products in the US. That's a lot.
It is.
So I guess one of our first questions was, how do you even start to manage that type of process? Like, what is your screening process and what do you look for when you're in the whole landscape of ETFs? Because like we said at the beginning, it's changed. Like I remember you had a few providers in the beginning, but it's really exploded over the last number of years.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start by talking about my team.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
The official title of my group is ETF Research and Strategy. That's pretty much what we do. Like you said, we cover all the ETFs in Canada, more than 1,300 of them, and more than 3,000 ETFs in the US. And we are part of the big ETF team here at National Bank. So our bank actually invested very heavily in the ETF business over the past 15 years. And so we have become Canada's only fully integrated one-stop brokerage that provides service offerings across ETF structuring, sales, trading, and as research. And so my team, we fall under equity research department. And so that means my colleagues are analysts who cover individual stocks. And so they have price target and buy and sell recommendations for the stocks. We don't have price target because, a lot of ETFs hold thousands of securities in the underlyings, and they have bond and they have derivatives in the portfolio. But we do track ETF fund flows, and we publish reports, ETF strategy, trade ideas, model portfolio, industry notes. And we also do a lot of custom work for any colleague within the bank. It could be, national bank financial markets, investment banking, ECM, sales, or wealth management, including advisory groups such as ourselves, and also institutional clients who trade with national banks, ETF trading desk. And by the way, they have consistently been the #1 ETF liquidity provider in Canada for years. So really strong capacity. And you mentioned, there's so many products. How we do it is team approach. So my team is a team of 4 people, full-time analysts and associates. You've been to our lunch and learn session before, so you've met everybody on my team. They're all super nice. So we are led by Daniel Strauss, and Dan has 13 years under his belt as ETF research analyst at National Bank.
And you've been here 8 years now,
8 years.
Like, I was sort of like, wow, time flies.
I know, time flies.
But your research is very helpful because it does offer that objective opinion, right? You're not trying to sell a product. It's really to figure out, here's the landscape and what are you trying to do and where it might fit. I know we've engaged your group with our client portfolios, looking at it to say, this is kind of the tax benefit we need in this area, and this is exposure to a certain sector. And we relied on you and your research because there's just so much out there. Like, how do you compare what iShares has, here's an S&P 500 and Vanguards and all the other ones, like they're all slightly different, and you kind of need to understand why they're different. And that's what you do.
That's right. So that's why we spend a lot of time managing our database, right? Looking at the filings, launches, delistings, and product changes that could lead to, changes in exposure or methodology. So that's really a lot of the work that we do. Yeah.
And how has it changed over the years? Like, you've been doing this for 8 years and the team longer, but like what trends have you seen change over your time?
Oh yeah, so that's a very good question, because actually the landscape has changed so much. You've already spoken to it a little bit. So some overall numbers. When I first started in 2015, we had about a dozen ETF issuers, and we had 400 ETF products, and we had about $80 billion in total Canadian ETF AUM, asset under management. But today we have 40 ETF issuers in Canada. We have more than 1,300 products, and we have about $400 billion in total AUM. And I think it's important to look at, not only the number of products, but also who is the ETF issuers. So we still have a very top-heavy market in ETF in Canada. The top 4 ETF issuers, RBC iShares, BMO, Vanguard, and Horizons, they combined represent about 70% of total ETF AUM in Canada, but increasingly we are seeing the success of smaller ETF issuers. They have their own areas of focus and specialty, and actually some of their products are among some of the fastest growing ETFs in Canada. So very successful for many of them.
And these are the ones that are a little bit smaller than the 4 you mentioned.
That's right. That's exactly right. And it's not only the number of issuers, right, but the complexity in the products have increased. We used to think, like you mentioned, ETFs are plain vanilla passive investments.
Passive, don't touch it.
Exactly.
Broad-based. That's what they were, but not anymore.
Not anymore. There's still a lot of ETFs that are that. In fact, a lot of investors use them in their core of the portfolio. And so even among those ETFs, there is a lot of differences as well. We can talk about that a little bit later. But, there are increasingly products that are very complex. They use option strategies, cover call, put and call right, collar, different kind of things. Some of them, they use leverage, a little bit of cash borrowing in the portfolio to help seek returns and enhance yield. And some use a combined option strategy and leverage. So they provide a very high distribution yield. And a lot of retail investors really like that. And there are ETFs that provide, long, short, hedge fund style alternative exposure.
Right.
And, single stock ETF that you just invest in one stock and or very concentrated portfolio of a few stocks in the portfolio, increasingly getting very complicated. And I think this is actually wonderful because, the product proliferation and increasing complexity speak to how investors are using ETFs. It's no longer just getting that broad-based exposure.
Right.
It's also risk management, protecting that downside.
That's true.
Or seeking income or fine-tuning the broad-based exposure with a little bit something.
Right.
That's all different ways that investors are using ETFs these days.
But it also, if you're an investor, you really have to understand the product.
Exactly.
Right? Because they are so more complex than before. You really have to understand. Like you mentioned leverage. And I remember years ago, it was a very trendy thing. When the markets went up, you had these wonderful leveraged ETFs. And then nobody realized, oh, wait, what about the downside? And it could be really painful. So you just need to understand what it is and in what capacity you want to engage in those, types of products.
That's exactly right. So if you are someone who understands the products or maybe have the help from professionals, then these products really could work for you. You can use them, as part of your toolkit to express your views tactically or strategically at very low cost.
Right.
And so, in Canada, the average ETF management expense ratio is around 50 basis points. So
5-0.
Yeah, 5-0,
50.
half of a percentage point. So you can really construct a very well-rounded portfolio for your client, for any part of the exposure that you want to get.
Right.
But if you are someone who really do not understand the product or do not have the time to do research,
right,
then you may end up getting products that do not align with your risk tolerance or investment horizon.
Right. Yeah, you got to watch for that.
Exactly.
Sure. Huh.
That's interesting. A quick question for you here, Tiff. You guys are saying that ETFs were passive. Now they're obviously much more active. Any idea as to where the ETF landscape possibly is going? It sounds like because just from you said,
ball, what's next?
From 2015, if I remember, you said you went from how many ETF providers to 40 now?
Yeah, 12 ETF providers to 40 ETF providers.
Right, so that's more than terrible. That's more than 3 times. And then from 80 billion to 400 billion.
Yeah, about 20% of growth rate in the past decade.
Wow.
Every year.
Yeah.
Wow.
20% just in the past year.
In the past decade. So that's 10 years.
10 years. Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So any idea as to how do you see the ETF landscape for the future playing out? Any ideas?
Yeah, I think the current trend likely will continue into the future because the
you
investors
think they're going to keep growing.
Exactly. The investors are, very sophisticated these days. And so, like we mentioned earlier, they are using ETFs in different ways. And also another momentum is that there is some new money going into ETF from mutual funds. So in the past 2 years, we actually had outflows from Canadian mutual funds for both of the years.
Right.
But in the past 2 years, we've had, inflows into Canadian ETFs. So for every year, basically in the past decade, we have inflows into ETFs.
And you think the complexity is going to get more complex, I guess? No pun intended. Like the complexity is going to increase of these ETFs?
I mean, it's possible, right? Well, just last year or the year before, we had the single stock ETF. Nobody thought about that before.
How does a single stock ETF work? Why can't you just buy the stock?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. But the ETFs, first of all, give you a lower price handle. Like say Tesla, before the share split, it was like $1,000. But some of the single stock ETF, they're like $25, right? So easier for you to buy.
Oh, easier for you to get access to Tesla.
Yeah.
Instead of buying it at $1,000 a share, for example, you're getting exposure to Tesla at $25.
Yeah, and plus there's currency hedging. Right? A lot of Canadian investors do not want US dollar currency exposure, and so there's currency hedging back to CAD. And then there's also a little bit of leverage in those ETF as well as cover call.
Right.
So they have higher distribution yield.
Well, I think as more people start to learn about them, like you guys do a really good report always around tax loss selling, right? Where maybe you sell a company that's down, but you don't want to lose that exposure for the superficial loss, right? You can't buy it back in the same month, but you'll buy an index fund to kind of take that exposure
That's
to
right.
kind of replace it in the portfolio.
Yeah, it was a wonderful time actually last year to have that strategy because the market rallied around October to November, which is when a lot of investors tend to do tax loss selling, right? So if they hadn't done that using ETF, they would be missing out on the market rally.
So may I, did you want to say something? I just had a quick question. So if I was a listener to this here, Tiff, and I heard you say, for example, you and your team of 4, and a bank like National Bank and the ETF, I guess, team in general, you guys cover 1,200 to 1,300 ETFs in Canada and over 3,000 in the US. So I'm going to be critical here. I'm going to play the devil's advocate. And I'm going to say, if I was a listener, I'd probably be like, do these guys, do you really cover them? Like, what's the depth or what's the breadth of the research you guys are doing covering that much? Like, you know the saying, a jack of all trades is a master of none.
Yeah.
But I know people don't know the remainder of that saying, but like, what's the breadth?
What is tell the remainder of the saying?
That it's still better to be a master at one.
Yeah, so we maintain very good relationship with all of the ETF issuers in Canada, and that's
with all 1,200 of them.
Well, that's the number of products, right? So the number of ETF issuers is 40.
Right. Okay.
And so we have relationship with all of them. And so that's where we do all of the work, right? So we do due diligence with the portfolio managers. If the ETF is actively managed, we, look at their investment style. We look at methodology because some of the actively managed ETF, they are actually quite concentrated. They have maybe 20 stocks in the holding, but it may not work for some investors. Right? So that's why it's important to do those due diligence to make sure that we understand how they do it.
Right.
Yeah. So that's maintaining that relationship is a big part of what we do.
Well, and you're leveraging, I think, technology to help you screen and filter and,
Have you guys used AI yet? Is AI
no.
Not yet?
Not yet. Okay. But we use Bloomberg, we use Python and SQL. Like our database actually has evolved over the years to cope with the increase in number of products.
Right.
And I think like ETF analysis actually is simple but not easy.
Right. So simple but not easy. Okay.
Yeah. So the reason I say that is because the ETF providers, they actually do a very good job of disclosing information online.
Right.
And so you can basically look at an ETF and find all of the relevant information you need from their website. Be it their exposure, sector, region, all the holdings, or maybe the management expense ratio, trading expense ratio, all of those basic metrics, bid-ask spread. You can find all of them online.
Right.
And so it's a matter of really knowing what's out there, right? That's the important part. And that's why, we come in to help you guys and anybody at National Bank to manage that large number of ETFs.
Yeah.
Is there any part in your analysis that you find a lot of people overlook? Like everybody kind of knows the check for the fees and things like that. But are there certain things that you as a professional would say, well, this is a really important thing that often gets overlooked?
That's a good question.
Oh, that's a very good question.
Thanks, Joelle.
Yes.
I come up with a good one every once in a while.
Always.
So it's so very good. Like every question that you guys are asking.
No, she asks much better ones.
Anyway, so it boils down to looking at different aspects of ETFs, right? So there is a exposure, which we talk about, and then there is performance, and then there's also cost, and there's also tax efficiency. And we can speak to all 4 of them, but given time, maybe I'll just mention one first, which is tax efficiency. This is an area where I think when a lot of investors do it themselves, they tend to ignore. But it's super important.
Right.
For sure, CRA always comes knocking. So it's very important.
They always do.
Yeah.
But we issue our standard disclaimer, though, when we talk about tax, is that we are not tax experts. So you really have to seek professional advice from tax people to make sure that, your situation is
for your
handled.
Specific situation.
Exactly. But generally speaking, we have seen investors hold a large amount in their very sizable ETF portfolio, Schwab ETFs in the US that hold Canadian stocks.
Oh.
So the Schwab listed ETF that hold, international exposure and that has Canadian stock in them.
Yeah.
So this is actually not tax efficient.
Right.
Because you are getting double withholding tax on a dividend, right? One way when the dividend gets paid to the US ETF and one way when it gets back paid to the Canadian investors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Good
this is
point.
really not tax efficient, and you can really use other ETFs because there are a lot of other
to cover
ETFs
off that exposure.
Exactly.
Right?
And
makes
then
sense.
a lot of high net worth client, they use US listed ETF as well, but they actually could be subject to US estate tax.
Yep.
Huh.
And that is really not tax efficient either.
No,
And there
no.
is a lot of Canadian ETFs to help you get around that problem. Good
Right.
problem to have.
And
Yeah,
your
yeah.
team can help in, for example, mitigating those like those estate taxes.
Well, it's
Those
being
estate law
mindful of the
taxes, right?
products that are available to help us avoid those
Yeah.
types of pitfalls,
Yeah.
right?
That's
So,
exactly right.
yeah.
Yeah, there's always ways that we can find, efficiency in how to improve the portfolio. Because
Right,
a lot of
right.
times, client or the advisor, they give us a list of ETF the client already hold. We look at it and we're like, maybe
How do you
this is
optimize? Yeah.
exactly, there's better product for that.
Right,
There's
right.
always ways that we can find efficiency.
Well, and who better
Yeah.
to go to than the person that knows all 1,300 and all 3,000 than the research team? So
That's quite the research.
Yes.
Well, we covered a lot of ground, but I definitely think we were going to have Tiffany back on because there is so much to
Yep.
cover and so much to analyze. And we thank you and your research team for all the help you provide our group ongoing.
Yeah.
Because it's totally invaluable. Like, there's not enough hours in the day to do what you guys do. So we're glad we have you doing that part and really enjoy your research reports.
Oh, thank you so
Yeah.
much, guys.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Until next time.